Now, there's been widespread condemnation of the violent protests and looting incidents that have broken out in various parts of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. And yesterday, ANC Chairperson Gwede Mantashe urged protesting residents to refrain from destroying property and to focus on stabilising already battered economies in the provinces. Now, this as various ANC and government leaders visited affected areas where a number of shops have been broken into and looted. Meanwhile, at least 25,000 members of the South African National Defence Force will soon be deployed to KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng to deal with the violence and the looting as soon as approval has been obtained for that deployment. So to help us unpack some of the underlying causes and also the impact and just generally looking at the unrest that we've witnessed over the past few days, we're joined by Nqabayomzi Kwankwa from the UDM, Member of Parliament, and Duma Gqubule, who is the founding director of the Centre for Economic Development and Transformation. And thanks so much to both of you for your time this morning, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, SK. Thank you.
Thanks for the invite, Sakina.
Mr. Kwankwa, let me start with you. So, over the past few days, I think even our South African exceptionalism has been tested, because you would know that South Africans always say that things that have happened elsewhere on the continent are very unlikely to happen here, until, of course, a few days ago when it seemed like perhaps we are not that different from the rest of the continent and what has transpired in years gone by. So please give us your sentiment of what you make of everything that has happened.
Firstly, I attribute most of the problems that we're experiencing now to a failure or to poor political leadership on the part of all politicians. For example, it's a damning indictment on the leadership of politicians that they have to wait for the army to be sent in before they are actually able to go in and even assess the damage. When the problem started a couple of days ago, I mean, it was clear what was happening on social networks, the incitement of violence that was taking place. After the first or second incident occurred, the first people who should have been dispatched to the front and center or the front lines of these community protests were their leaders, the political leaders. I remember clearly, Sakina, in 2015, when there was a flare-up of xenophobic violence, the UDM was the only political party that made a proposal and wrote to the Speaker and said, close Parliament, send MPs back to their constituencies so that they can be able to calm the situation down. There was no deployment of senior NEC members from political parties. There was not even the ANC, which started the problem. There was also no deployment of public representatives when the problem started to try and actually quell the violence and calm the situation down. All that politicians were doing were condemning in their strongest possible terms, sitting in their fancy offices, including the president, by the way. The president kept on just addressing us from TV instead of being in the front lines of what was happening, engaging communities, acknowledging. It doesn't matter whether you agree with what has made people angry, the arrest of President Zuma and the violence, if you like, even the criminality that crept in after that. But we have to acknowledge that people are angry for some or other reason. But you also have to acknowledge the socio-economic challenges, which are a major contributing factor to what we've also seen over the past. There's an element of criminality. There's an element the aspect which you can't deny, the political aspect of anger, discontentment. But we also cannot do away or deny the fact that a number of our people, millions of our people are poor. And that has also been worsened, for example, if you look by the coronavirus. And the fact that even when the coronavirus, the lockdown started, people were promised bailouts which never materialized. Sectors were promised bailouts. And a lot of people were retrenched. People are unemployed and poor. But at some point, we also need to deal with the foundational issues, mistakes that were made. Firstly, if you were to look at where we came from in the past, the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry, which to some extent may have put its legitimacy or credibility at stake in the eyes of those who had to comply. And even now, if you were to look at the fact, whether you like President Zuma or not, the fact that the Constitutional Court allowed itself in this context to be a court of first and last instance has created a number of challenges, which now some of the people are actually taking advantage of. The fact of the matter is, even in the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry, mistakes were made, which I think left the Commission and the judiciary to some extent vulnerable, which is a matter and a point we raised as far back as 2017.
Duma Gqubule, if we look at Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, these two provinces combined account for about 50% of South Africa's GDP. What does all of this mean for an economy that was already on its knees, an economy that had failed to create any meaningful jobs for South Africans, and of course poverty and inequality that has been rampant and perhaps at the highest end of anywhere in the world already prior to what we've seen now? What does all of this mean for our economy?
Thank you for the invite, Sakina. I just have to mention up front that I've tried to stay away from the media interviews, but it was only because of you that I decided to participate in this as one of the country's great broadcasters. The reason I've tried to stay away from this is that it's deeply personal, and I don't want to be dragged into debates that I don't want to be part of. It's deeply personal because I was detained at the age, I joined the ANC in Swaziland at the age of 14. I was at school there. And I was detained at the airport in Durban at the age of 15. And at the heart of this, the ANC has failed the people of South Africa. There's betrayed the dreams and promises of our liberations. There is no ducking and diving away from that. That is the heart of the problem. And then the first thing, as Mr. Kwankwa correctly says, we cannot just make this a security issue. At the first, there is a political grievance, as Mr. Kwankwa was saying. And whether it's correct or not, it must be addressed. And the political leaders should have been at the scene in KZN when this thing started. And the second thing you talk about is the economic situation. We are an unviable society right now. We have 74% unemployment amongst youth, 47.8%, I'm using these statistics, South Africa racial categories, which are problematic. Black Africans, 47.8% Black Africans, 51.5% Black African females, 50% in Limpopo, 50% in the Eastern Cape. Also, 10 million people, according to the NIDS-CRAM survey, went hungry during April and May when they were surveyed, including 3 million children. So there's mass hunger in our society. And then on top of that, Sakina, our government at the beginning of the year, they cut 36 billion rands from social grants. Then they end the social relief of distress grants. And then after that, we have these vicious power blackouts, and we have the water outages. And then the government implements this over-the-top lockdown and then doesn't allocate a cent towards the millions of people who would be affected by this lockdown. And then we're surprised as to what is happening in our country. So yes, so there was a political grievance that was the initial spark, and then it morphed into something else. And at the heart of this is that we have to address the socio-economic crisis in our country. I've been hearing people glibly say we must have a state of emergency. I lived under apartheid. I don't want us to go back there. It cannot be a substitute for the government's failure to restore public safety. And in the same way that we can't have a lockdown as a substitute for government's failure to implement successful public health measures that have been implemented in other parts of the country. People don't know what the state of emergency is. I was arrested when I was 15. Under state of emergency, you can arrest 15-year-old looters under no explanation. So I don't want us to see that. And we must stop calling people terrorists. Because once you start calling people terrorists, we have a state of emergency. That is a slippery slope towards a civil war in South Africa. So we must be careful about the things that we say. And if the government can't restore public safety, there's no reason why they can't restore public safety with the current regulations they have under the Disaster Act. Yeah.
But let's look at why people are calling for that state of emergency. I concur fully with you in terms of the reasons why it is perhaps not a good idea. But one has to acknowledge that the reason why people are calling for that is because people are just at their wits' end. What we've noticed over the past few days, the looting in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng, it just carried on wantonly, unabated, and it was as if it was just a free-for-all. There was nothing to stop it. It carried on for days, probably still carrying on in places. So it begs the question, is there even a government in this country at this stage? Mr. Kwankwa?
Well, people laughed at me when I once said that the ANC government is a government in office and not in power. The reason why Mr. Gqubule is quite correct in saying the reason why people are calling for a state of emergency is because they are frustrated. It's because they can see that it's the looters that have taken control of their communities and not the government. The government has failed to protect their private properties, to protect property, and to protect, in some instances, even lives, because we have lost many lives. A lot of people have died, unnecessarily so, because what happened, Sakina, is a situation where we fail to manage this thing politically. There has been no acknowledgement of the political grievance, whether rightly or wrongly, by some politicians in order for you to earn the right to be able to get through to those who are aggrieved. Whether they are rightly or wrongly aggrieved, but the bottom line is that grievance needs to be addressed and acknowledged at some point before you can get the right to be able to speak to those people. So it's the failure of political leadership that has led us here, preeminently represented by the first citizen of the country, the President Ramaphosa. He reacted too late and chose to conduct press conferences and to talk to us from the union buildings instead of being seen in the ground of what the problems were happening. But it's also a question of a failure of intelligence. Crime intelligence is completely collapsed in South Africa. I mean, I'm sure you saw on social networks, people would say, tomorrow we are going to visit this area, that day we are going to do this is what we're going to do. And when those people arrived, precisely in the areas they said they were going to visit, there was no presence of the police, there was no one trying to prevent that. But SK, whether we like it or not, there's a debate that this country needs to have around the mistakes that we made in the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry, which we warned about in 2017. We said, we understand that the recommendation from the public protector was well-intentioned. There were dynamics and challenges that contributed to that. But we did warn that when you usurp the executive authority or powers of a president without following the constitution in terms of how it's applied, in terms of that section 84, subsection 2F, where the appointing authority is the president, and if the president is not able to appoint a commission of inquiry or is otherwise unable to perform the duties of president in terms of section 90, then it means that you have a deputy president kicking in to play that role. It was done in the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions. We should have undertaken that step in order to ensure the credibility of the process, because those who are against the Commission of Inquiry currently are looking for any reason, all right? Anything that people can use to try and discredit the process. But I think we also made the Commission of Inquiry and its entire process also vulnerable. Add to that, for example, what I've just mentioned. I think it's been discussed or canvassed extensively in the public, the fact that the Concord also made a mistake by allowing itself to be the court of first and last instance, and therefore, to a large extent, making it difficult for President Zuma to be able to purge his contempt of court or to appeal it for that matter. And now, when you look at the totality of the issue, starting from the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry and some of the mistakes which have been made recently, in their totality, they present a lot of challenges. Whether, for example, I know you can't interfere with the legal process, but it's a discussion that we need to have to say what were some of the mistakes that were made, what should be the way forward from here in order to try and address some of the challenges. But also at some point, the political issue of saying it's the politicians who should be at the front and center of all this, the instability. We should be seeking to find solutions to the problem. The reason why the army was dispatched too soon is because the government and politicians had completely lost control of the situation. It was as if the looters were the ones who were in charge.
And that seems to be the case. Then, Duma Gqubule, added to the already disgruntled group that Nqabayomzi Kwankwa speaks about, you now have about 40,000 businesses and business owners who've been affected by all of this, to add to that group of already disgruntled people. You look at KwaZulu-Natal, they're talking at this point of losses in the region of at least 15 billion rand and counting. And all of that put together, the failure of government to act. Should we not just disband the whole lot, given what we saw? Like, if you look at the pictures on your screen, what happened on Queen Nandi Drive over the past 2 days, where there was no intervention from the state in any way, shape or form. It's a free-for-all. At least that is the picture that's emerging. So what needs to happen from here on in? And as Mr. Kwankwa was saying, should we not get down to the root causes here? What actually is going on? Are we being dragged as the whole nation into an ANC factional fight to the extent that the country is losing a grip?
Yes, that's correct, Sakina. You correctly say that we mustn't be dragged into an ANC fight. The ANC is dragging us into its idiotic factional fights, and I will never be part of that. And I appeal to South Africans, don't get involved in these idiotic factional fights of the ANC. Let us focus on the real issue, which is the worsening unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Let's focus on the austerity policies of this government, whereby they have cut 39 billion rands from the police budget, and they're retrenching 18,000 soldiers. They've cut 15 billion rands from the defense budget. The Minister of Defense and the head of the defense, they've also condemned these austerity policies here. And what we need to do, Sakina, we have to have a serious discussion around the economic response to this crisis. The government got it completely wrong. Every single country in the world has decided to spend their way out of this crisis. Global stimulus packages were $16 trillion. That is 17% of world's GDP. Our government is planning to withdraw 265 billion rands from the economy. It is insane. Why are we different? Right now, we need a proper economic response, and there's three elements of it. I will talk about Joe Biden's response, bold response in the US. There must be a humanitarian response. That is called the American Rescue Act in the US. The humanitarian response must, when there's an earthquake, the first thing you do is to do the humanitarian things. Look after the families that have been affected. So I say we must have a basic income grant. There are so many studies that I've been reading over the past six months which have explained how this basic income grant can be paid for and how to cost it. I am prepared to present to all political parties, including the UDM, as to how we can implement this. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say, that's the first thing. Then we have to have a jobs plan in terms of the infrastructure, the development of our country. Then the third thing that we have to have is a social security response. That's what the Americans did. So I just said we have to have a meaningful stimulus. And many of us have presented alternatives. I was at NEDLAC recently, about 10 days ago, where I presented 11 options how to get rid of this austerity policies and finance a proper response to this crisis. The government is not listening to anything well-costed, explained alternative economic policies. We must, as South Africans, say no to these austerity policies. I warned about this about a year ago, and I said we are facing a dystopian future if we implement these economic policies. And that is what you're seeing right now.
We're out of time, but Duma, when you say government does not listen, any idea as to why they're not listening?
The sad thing, Sakina, is that, I worked with the president from his office back in the day, and he's one of the nicest people that you'll ever meet. But he's got it completely wrong on this one, and he is completely deaf to any alternative that has been presented to the government and many people in the government. I don't understand it at all. Yeah.
Nqabayomzi Kwankwa, as we're out of time, okay, you can have that final word.
Well, if this government was willing to listen, they would have adopted some of the proposals that we as opposition parties offered free of them to them free of charge in Parliament. They don't listen to them. I mean, we've had the discussion. I will gladly accept the document from Mr. Gqubule explaining the basic income grant, but we have proposed it in Parliament. There's many political parties. It has fallen on deaf ears. We've actually tabled various modalities in terms of how to turn around the South African economy. Those discussions and proposals on the table, including parties offering strategic proposals when it comes to an industrial strategy that we want to adopt. We're among the few political parties last year when the government announced the 500 billion rand stimulus package. We said, if you're only shifting money from budget lines, you're not providing any stimulus package. You're just robbing Peter to pay Paul. You need to inject money into the economy, track it, make sure that you are able to see the social impact of the bailouts that you do. Use a targeted approach. We had those discussions and made those proposals, and they fell on deaf ears because most leaders of the ANC, when they see bailouts and they see money, they see an opportunity to loot, which is what has brought us to where we are today.
Well, we have to park this discussion at this point, but thank you so much for your time. Nqabayomzi Kwankwa, Member of Parliament with the United Democratic Movement, as well as Duma Gqubule, who is the founding director of the Centre for Economic Development and Transformation Issues.